Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian is often called the most brutal book of all time. Many have pointed out how no one could possibly make a film adaptation of it because it is just that horrifying. And I do agree that the novel is gruesome and terrifying and awe-inspiringly violent in a way that's difficult to put into words. But the violence in Blood Meridian is not for its own sake. It's not superfluous, and it's not there just for shock value. Blood Meridian is one of the most philosophically rich novels I have ever read, and much of that philosophy is intrinsically tied up with its violence. So today, we are going to look at this infamous novel as a treatise on the nature and philosophy of violence itself. And I hope that by the end of it, I've convinced you that while the brutality of Blood Meridian truly is shocking, that is only the first layer, and there really is no end to how deep this rabbit hole goes. As always, please bear in mind that I can't cover the full depth of the novel here, and I really do think it's worth reading the book for yourself to get your own unique interpretation. But first, let's just take a moment to remind ourselves of the general outlines of the plot, so we're all on the same page moving forward. And if it wasn't already clear, spoilers ahead. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. Blood Meridian, a brief recap. See the child. He is pale and thin. He wears a thin and ragged linen shirt. So begins Blood Meridian, and we are introduced to our quasi-protagonist, the kid. Born to a dead mother and a neglectful father, the kid leaves his home at age 14 on a lifelong odyssey across the Old West. Why? We are not explicitly told. The first part of the book follows the kid as he just goes from town to town, picking up odd bits of work and getting into scrapes. He gets into a street brawl with a man named Toadvine, who will soon become one of his only consistent friends. In one of these towns, he ducks into a tent where a preacher is giving a sermon, and a hulking, hairless man steps in. This is Judge Holden, otherwise known as simply the Judge. The Judge accuses the preacher of abusing children, and the preacher is shot by one of his own congregation. Later, at a saloon, the Judge reveals to the kid that he'd never even met the priest before and had seemingly made up the lie on the spot for some unknown purpose, or maybe no purpose at all. The kid will see the Judge again, but not for some time. The kid continues getting into fights and scrapes and brawls, and eventually catches the eye of a recruiter who drafts him into a ragtag militia seeking to fight the Mexican army. The kid agrees, but the militia falls apart at the first sign of trouble, and the kid wanders the desert for days and days, attempting to find a town after basically the entire militia is wiped out. Eventually, he is captured by Mexican troops and is imprisoned. By chance, Toadvine is in the same cell, and it's at this point where the Glanton Gang ride into town. There is Glanton, the leader of the gang atop his horse, and riding beside him is Judge Holden, the same man from earlier, still just as huge and hairless and menacing as ever. They are in the town of Chihuahua to receive a bounty from the governor, who is promising to pay for the head of an outlaw named Gomez, as well as any Native American scalps. Toadvine somehow manages to convince the gang that he, the kid, and another prisoner are seasoned shooters, and Glanton recruits them from the jail, the governor releasing them from their imprisonment. Thus commences the rampaging escapades of the Glanton Gang, in Blood Meridian at least. This was an actual historical gang that really did exist in the late 1840s and up to 1850. However, most of the events specifically described in Blood Meridian are fictional. The gang picks up some new, technologically advanced pistols at a nearby town and then sets out on their macabre hunting. Their first kill isn't an outlaw, however. It is instead an elderly Native American woman that they just so happen to stumble across and whose scalp could pass for an outlaw's. So any illusion that the gang was killing out of a genuine belief that the innocent people under the governorship of this governor were under threat immediately resolves. Now, Blood Meridian is a tale full of lies and deceit, and somewhere else we can often find lies and deceit is on our newsfeed, which is why I recommend you check out today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that gathers related articles from thousands of sources around the world in one place, so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. Every story comes with a clear breakdown of the political bias, factuality, ownership, and headlines of the reporting sources, with ratings backed by independent news monitoring organizations. Ground News are very kindly offering anyone who uses my link or scans my QR code 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan as a special deal, so I highly encourage you to snap this up. For instance, let's see how left and right-wing publications differed on their reporting on the recent US government shutdown. Whereas left-wing sources attributed the shutdown to good faith disagreements about healthcare policy, right-wing sources framed it as an unreasonable overreaction by Democratic representatives. I especially like the blind spots feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by either the left or the right. This feed helps readers step into the other side's news reality and understand the different narratives that can shape their beliefs, such as left-wing sources missing an attempt by Elon Musk to support a boycott of Netflix, or right-wing sources missing a ruling in Washington state stating that immigrants have the right to bond hearings. I don't have a lot of time to keep up with the news as the channel keeps me very busy, and certainly not to examine every article I read for bias individually. So receiving my Ground News roundup at the end of every day means that I can get a variety of different news opinions, learn which sources are trustworthy, and just make the world less of a bewildering mess. Ground News is giving my viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. They've genuinely become my go-to news source, and I really hope that you'll check them out. But anyway, back to the video. The gang then get into a few different shootouts and scrapes, eventually coming across a camp of Native Americans, and what follows is a massacre beyond all reason. The gang spared no one and collect their scalps to hand in to the governor, whether it is a man or a woman or even a child. When they return to the governor, they are greeted as heroes by the townspeople and are invited to the governor's mansion, a mansion which they then proceed to absolutely trash before terrorizing the town for a few days and leaving it in a dilapidated mess. When they do leave, they leave with a bounty on their heads. They continue this process of collecting bounties at different towns and generally causing trouble before rioting in the towns themselves for quite a long time. It's unclear exactly how long. Eventually, however, their fortunes start to turn downwards. They get involved in a shootout in one town that leaves a few of their number dead and some others wounded, and there aren't a lot of them, so this is a pretty big loss. They start to become pretty arrogant, and they begin to start fights they almost certainly can't finish, and seemingly revel in just pissing people off for the sheer thrill of it. They have an encounter with a full-on Mexican army under General Elias, and a few more are dead and a few more are wounded after this shootout. And the gang has to go on the run from effectively an overwhelming military force that they somehow thought they could take on. The gang kill their own wounded so they don't have to transport them, and so they don't face a more grisly death at the hands of the elements or the enemy. The kid is tasked with killing one of these wounded men, but he just can't bring himself to do it. He thus falls behind the gang for a few days, during which he encounters a burning tree in the wilderness, in a scene that's pretty reminiscent of Moses encountering the burning bush. He catches up with the gang, who now come across as haggard and exhausted. The once seemingly invincible set of amoral warriors who could destroy entire towns has been laid low by time and attrition. As the gang travel, McCarthy gives us a number of scenes where they're just sitting around a campfire talking about life or philosophy or God or violence. Here, we get one of the most thematically important passages in the novel, as the judge regales the gang with a twisted sermon, during which he declares, among other things, that morality is a fable and that war is the only true God of this world. We'll definitely be coming back to this later in the video. Tobin, a member of the gang who used to be a priest, also tells the kid how the judge met the gang and how he came to get involved with their motley crew. Back when they had far fewer members, Glanton's gang were being pursued by a superior force of Native Americans. They were out of powder and all seemed doomed. But then they came to the judge, sitting at a crossroads in the desert, perfectly at home. They didn't have a clue how he got there or what his purpose was. He didn't even carry a water flask. The judge takes the men under his wing and leads them up to the mountains, where they manage to make gunpowder out of their own urine and various natural ingredients. The judge saved their lives by bringing fire from the earth, and thus allowing them to fight off the Native Americans, and has been with them ever since. Despite the judge saving his life, Tobin questions whether it was worth it, or whether the judge is now a curse the gang must bear. They pass through an outpost where they commit yet another murder, and also pick up a strange pair of travellers, a man and his little brother, who is called an idiot. That is, someone with severe mental difficulties who can't really comprehend the world around him. The gang eventually come to a ferry that monopolizes the crossing into most of California. They hatch a plan with a local Native American tribe called the Yuma to take over the ferry and run it together. But when the time comes, they choose to betray the Yuma instead and gun down most of them, taking over the ferry for their own sole use. They rob travelers blind as the travelers try to use the ferry, and generally the gang makes an absolute fortune while also turning this little ferry outpost into a den of debauchery and violence. However, the Yuma soon have their revenge, and most of the Glanton Gang, including Glanton himself, are cut to pieces in a raid, while the Yuma take over the ferry crossing. The kid, Toadvine, and Tobin barely escape with their lives, and they have to cross the desert to a well, only to meet the judge, who is with the mentally impaired man, and they're both naked. The mentally impaired man is sort of yapping at the judge's heels. Tobin and the kid move on, but Toadvine stays at the well, and we later see him hanged. The kid briefly considers killing the judge, for he does happen to have a pistol with him, but he relents at the last minute. Tobin and the kid then attempt to make their way across the desert to safety, but the judge has clearly decided that they must die. He pursues them with the idiot in tow, crossing sands and valleys to do so. He calls out to the kid as he does this, telling him that he always knew that the kid's heart wasn't in the gang. Eventually, Tobin and the kid manage to lose the judge, and they are rescued by a group of Native Americans. Eventually, they then come to San Diego, where Tobin goes to get them a doctor, but he unfortunately is never seen again. The kid is arrested, and funnily enough, the judge goes to visit him in his cell, where he again expresses his annoyance that the kid was never truly in with the gang, that he had betrayed them in some sense. The kid is released from jail for unknown reasons, and while he is recovering from his wounds, he dreams of the judge, as well as another man, a maker of counterfeit coins. Cryptically, towards the end of the dream, we are told the following. It is this false moneyer with his gravers and burins who seeks favour with the judge, and he is at contriving from cold slag, brute in the crucible, a face that will pass, an image that will render this residual species current in the markets where men barter. Of this is the judge, and the night does not end. We'll definitely be coming back to this. It's one of the most difficult passages in the novel. The kid takes up work escorting travellers across the desert, keeping them safe from harm rather than robbing them. The people around him sense that he has been through all manner of violence and brutality, and this lends him an air of authority and respect in the eyes of others. He comes across a group of ascetics while he's on a job who are whipping themselves as they ascend a mountain. He follows, but when he comes to them, they've already been slaughtered by some unknown group. The kid rushes to help the single survivor, but it turns out that she too is dead and has been dead for a long time, presumably through some previous calamity. After this, we suddenly jump to the year 1878, and the kid, now very much a grown man, is sitting at a camp in the wilderness, and he invites a few adolescents over to share his fire. He gets into an altercation with one of them and ends up shooting him dead, thus returning to his old ways. The dead young man's friends leave, taking with them his brother, now orphaned and alone. The kid comes to a town in the desert and enters the saloon to have a drink. Watching him across the layered smoke in the yellow light was the judge. The years have not changed the judge, and he and the kid begin to talk, the last survivors of Glanton's gang. The judge implores the kid to join the dance, which is a strange mixture of dark fate, destiny, and eternal conflict and war, and a horrifying way of life. The kid drinks a little, sleeps with a lady of the night, and stumbles outside the saloon. The ending of Blood Meridian is notoriously cryptic and open to interpretation, so I will just describe it as it appears to me. People are shouting outside the saloon that a little girl has gone missing. The kid goes to the outhouses, also outside the saloon, where the judge is waiting in one of them, naked, to kill and envelop the kid. Later, some men come across the remains of the kid, and they are shocked and appalled, but we, the reader, get no description. The last thing that we see is the judge, dancing in the saloon, and the following is proclaimed. He dances in light and shadow, and he is a great favourite. He never sleeps, the judge. He is dancing, dancing. He says that he will never die. McCarthy writes a brief epilogue of a man who is seemingly preparing a piece of land for offence at some unspecified time in the future. He's making circular holes in the ground, while others, either human or animal, watch on from the wilderness. The final lines of the epilogue read as follows. That track of holes that runs to the rim of the visible ground, and which seems less the pursuit of some continuance than the verification of a principle, a validation of sequence and causality, as if each round and perfect hole owed its existence to the one before it, there on that prairie, upon which are the bones and the gatherers of bones and those who do not gather. He strikes the fire in the hole and draws out his steel. Then they all move on again. Again, we will be coming back to the symbolic importance of this later. Don't worry if it seems absolutely mysterious right now. Blood Meridian is, in many ways, a book that is more united by developing a theme than by developing a straightforward plot. So if some of the events in this synopsis have seemed disconnected from one another, or if you can't sort the book into a neat three-act structure, then that's absolutely fine. In fact, I imagine that is partly what McCarthy intended. And while we will be talking an awful lot about the events contained within this plot, the whole book is embedded in McCarthy's particular and deliberate style and use of language. So I really think that before we talk about the events in any kind of analytic detail, we ought to begin our analysis there. 2. The language of myth and the language of matter. One of the first difficulties people tend to have reading Blood Meridian is the particular way that McCarthy uses language. On the one hand, his prose can be stark, brutally efficient, and coldly naturalistic. Blood Meridian is striking for its total refusal to examine the character's mental states or inner world, focusing instead on the external world. Our protagonist, well, kind of, the kid, is just never given any kind of rich inner description. For the most part, we are in the dark about exactly why he does what he does. We're only privy to his mental states when he chooses to speak, and even then, he technically could be lying. This aspect of the novel could have been written by an extreme philosophical behaviorist, someone who thinks that the whole world, including the human mind, stops at what we can see externally and publicly. And yet, alongside this almost clinical manner of description, there is another very contrasting vocabulary at work. This is the language of myth and fable, of scripture and of the Old and New Testaments. This way of putting things emphasizes the spiritual dimension of events. It animates the world, comparing natural phenomena to legendary creatures or the workings of unseen conscious spirits. We see this mode when McCarthy describes the mountain ranges as the backs of sea beasts. Religious language is used generously throughout the novel, with travelers often compared to pilgrims and men compared to hell beasts and spirits and jinn. This can make reading Blood Meridian a brilliant but also rather tricky experience. The language itself effectively tries to weave together two seemingly incompatible worlds. The world of stark materialism on the one hand, and the world of sacred or anti-sacred religiosity on the other. But I do think that it is in this tension between these two linguistic modes that McCarthy creates his distinctive atmosphere. On average, people tend to pay far more attention to the religious nature of McCarthy's language than the naturalistic part. But I think that we can overemphasize this. Although much of the framing of Blood Meridian is like that of a fable or a legend or a myth, we mustn't forget that McCarthy himself took the factual research for the novel incredibly seriously. He spent months combing through historical documentation, as well as physically traveling some of the routes that his characters would eventually take, so that he would be able to do justice to these things in his prose. He even learnt a lot of Spanish for the Spanish sections of the book. This suggests that the historical and naturalistic dimension of Blood Meridian was at least incredibly important to McCarthy, and so I don't just think we should discount it. Just because it's less eye-catching than the high myth doesn't mean that it can be discarded out of hand. After all, this naturalistic language is part of what lends Blood Meridian its somewhat unadorned quality, and I do mean that as a compliment. The violence is partly so shocking and stark because it is described with the precision of a surgeon, often with no illusory edifice to go on top of it, and if McCarthy does bring in a mythological component, it is often after this incredibly naturalistic, violent description. When McCarthy paints violence, he does so with a matter-of-fact air that outright refuses romanticization, and this is partly because he pays such attention to the minute, disturbing specifics of how the physical anatomy of a particular corpse might look. References to sinews and jawbones and the like, they bring the image into focus and they make it undeniable to consciousness. It's as if McCarthy is preventing the reader from having anywhere to run and anywhere to hide by ensuring that he uncloaks the violence that has been committed. You get the sense that the sheer brutality of Blood Meridian is representative of the kinds of things that would have actually happened around this bloody period in US history, and that in turn makes it hit home emotionally. The idea that, even though these particular events might be fictional, someone, somewhere, almost certainly went through something that was close to or analogous to this is absolutely key to the impact of the novel, and the commitment to cold, unflinching descriptions of violence is a huge part of how McCarthy achieves this effect. If it were all mystical language and legendary framings, then I think it would be much easier to romanticize or denaturalize the violence. Let's call this the grounding part of McCarthy's language. It is what brings the text down to earth. On the other hand, the mystical or mythological language serves a different, but just as vital function. It tugs us away from the particular setting of mid-19th century America and suggests that the overarching themes of the novel, including its violence and what it says about human nature, are in some sense universalizable or at least generalizable. To give just one example of this, our protagonist, the kid, is deliberately left unnamed. Why is this? Well, sadly, I was not in McCarthy's head when he wrote Blood Meridian, but one thing this does do in the novel is de-specify the kid. It makes it seem like he could be anyone, or at least could be a huge range of people. Thus, what happens to the kid and what the kid does has the air of reflecting upon humanity as a whole, rather than just remaining limited to this particular scenario and this particular person. Likewise, by describing landscapes in legendary terms, McCarthy gives the impression that while this definitely is a historically grounded story for all the reasons we've just discussed, it's not only a historically grounded story. It is, in some sense, reflective of far broader ideas concerning the whole stretch of human experience and the whole stretch of human existence. This is a pretty well-used technique for creating this epic or universalizing aspect to a story and its message. We see it, for example, in the Book of Job, where we get very scant information about Job and what Job is like, beyond that he is blameless and that he has land, sons, and daughters. He's also placed in a foreign land called Uz, which some have even speculated was fictional. All of this serves to keep Job at a distance from particular known times and places, and so generalizes his story and its theological themes. It's the same sort of effect given by the Star Wars films opening with the phrase, "a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away." The distance creates a kind of philosophical generalizability to the statements in the novel. So, when McCarthy describes the world in this mystical fashion, it serves much the same purpose. It's the flip side of this grounding effect created by the overtly naturalistic language, and it is in an interesting tension with it. Blood Meridian is definitely happening in the 1840s and 50s in the Old West, but it's not only happening there. The same patterns that are found in Blood Meridian are found everywhere. The events emanate outwards and are found reflected in the rest of our world. It becomes a kind of microcosm-macrocosm relationship. This melding of styles also clues us into what will become one of the major themes of the novel, and thus also of this video. The relationship between the natural and the sacred, or the descriptive and the normative, or the mere and the valuable. Some of my favourite writings about Blood Meridian and McCarthy more generally are found within Petramundic's A Bloody and Barbarous God, The Metaphysics of Cormac McCarthy, where he puts forward an incredibly sophisticated argument for overriding Gnosticism in McCarthy's books. And we'll be discussing Gnosticism in more detail in the next section, but just to give you a taste of it now, one of the key aspects in Gnostic thought is the relationship between our fallen, corrupt material world and a higher divine one that we all have an innate potential to make contact with. In straddling these two styles, McCarthy also, deliberately or otherwise, straddles this dualist division within Gnosticism. On the one hand, there is the fallen world, which seems dark, barren, and meaningless and empty. And yet, on the other hand, there is this richer, infused spiritualism lurking in the background, for better and for worse. It's an incredibly potent linguistic choice McCarthy makes, because it forces us to confront this division at every moment in the text. It has the feel of not merely reporting events or crafting a story, but in some sense, creating a myth. And this forces the reader to scrape each line for spiritual and philosophical significance. This choice is not unique to McCarthy. Steinbeck is also famous for mixing a kind of naturalism with biblical or legendary style. This happens most notably in East of Eden, but it also does feature in his other works like The Grapes of Wrath, albeit a little bit more subtly. I've also heard that Herman Melville does this very well, but I've not read much of him, so I'm just taking people's word for it. In each case, there is a sense that these novels are crafting the myth and legend of America. And it means that McCarthy's story can use symbolically rich imagery and allusions without it coming across as cartoonish. I can only imagine how difficult a balance this is to strike, because it could very easily make Blood Meridian seem a bit trite. There is no shortage of biblically or mythologically infused novels that come across as a little bit naff or unnatural or overwrought. The reason I wanted to open with this point on language is because I sometimes see it get overlooked when people are discussing Blood Meridian in popular discourse, but I also think that it sets the tone for the rest of our analysis of the novel. If the rest of our discussion will be on what the garment of Blood Meridian looks like, this is just establishing the material from which it's made. Additionally, it helps to establish that this is a novel that we are meant to read into. McCarthy's choices all indicate that this is a symbolically infused book that is ripe for philosophical and literary analysis. When we talk about what it says about the nature of humanity, we're not just making things up. The novel itself invites this kind of attitude. But, having said all that, let's move on to a theme that often leaps out at people when they read Blood Meridian, and also ties very heavily into those Gnostic ideas we just mentioned. 3. A hostile world and hostile men. We're going to talk a lot about Gnosticism in this video, so it's worth asking how Gnostics actually did perceive the world, and what this has to do with McCarthy's horror-infused West. Bear in mind that Gnosticism is, of course, just so much more complicated than I'm going to present it here. It's not even one neat view. It's a sort of umbrella of different views in early Christian thought, which sometimes even meld themes of Zoroastrianism with Christianity. So, to speak of Gnosticism as one set of beliefs is a bit of a misnomer, but it's just sort of a necessary one for the sake of not making this video last until the heat death of the universe. If you do want to learn more about Gnosticism, I highly recommend checking out the channel Esoterica, as it is just brimming with fantastic information about this. Broadly speaking, we can think of Gnostics as having an anti-world theology. In contrast to classic Christianity, which holds that God made the world and ultimately thought it good, Gnostics believed that the world was made by a demiurge, a god of limited power, who forged the world against the wishes of the true, good and transcendent God. So we've got two powerful divine beings at play here. Depending on who you ask, the demiurge is either outright evil and malevolent, or just generally indifferent to the wishes and whims of humanity. This material world is, from a Gnostic perspective, then a profound disaster. In fact, the greatest disaster in history. However, despite this initial pessimistic framing, all is not lost, because the true God, sometimes called the monad, manifests as a divine spark in the heart of every person, and this maintains their connection to this higher spiritual order. The kind of knowledge that would liberate you from the constraints of this imperfect, fallen material world was called gnosis, hence Gnosticism. Such gnosis was meant to help you reunite with the Godhead, of which your particular divine spark is just a temporarily separated piece. Gnosticism does share some similarities with classic Christian denominations, in that its ultimate goal is reconciliation and connection with the one true God. However, the way they perceive this world in its material form is fundamentally different. For one thing, whereas in most forms of Christianity, God created the world good and we made it imperfect with our disobedience and sin, Gnostics held that the world was made bad or imperfect or outright evil at the start, no human element required. This means that while in most forms of Christianity, there is an allowance for plenty of joy and pleasure in this fleshy form, Gnostics tended to be much more hostile towards this. Again, I'm massively generalizing here, but take someone like C.S. Lewis, for example. Lewis held that bodily pleasure, in its proper context, came from God, as all good and pleasurable things do. This line of argument just doesn't quite follow for Gnostics, since it relies on the implicit assumption that the material world can be good and inhabit goodness because it was made by God. But this is precisely what Gnostics deny. They don't think that the one true God made the world. We don't need to worry about the details of Gnostic cosmology too much for this particular video, though it is interesting and I do recommend checking it out. The two main points that we want to bear in mind are just the general hostility towards the material world itself as evil, and the idea that each person, despite this, has a divine spark that they can use to reconnect with the true God. It's a sort of a point of optimism floating in a lake of pessimism. Now, if you're already familiar with Blood Meridian, you may already be spotting a lot of connections between this worldview and the way McCarthy describes the world in his novel. We've already seen how he personifies the world using mythological and fabular language, but he also does this in a way that emphasizes the threatening and hostile nature of the world, painting it as, in some sense, conscious and evil. Take this description of a tornado. Far out on the desert to the north, dust spouts rose wobbly and augured the earth, and some said they'd heard of pilgrims borne aloft like dervishes in those mindless coils, to be dropped broken and bleeding upon the desert again, and there perhaps to watch the thing that had destroyed them lurch onwards like some drunken djinn, and resolve itself once more into the elements from which it sprang. The tornado is not presented as an unconscious, unfeeling event from mythology, nor as the unintended side effect of some being who doesn't necessarily mean anyone harm, but is just big and powerful, like the earthquakes that were said to be caused by the writhing of the world serpent in Norse mythology. Rather, the tornado is analogized to the direct, meaningful action of an intentional spirit, in this case, a jinn, and the travelers are made into pilgrims and dervishes. A dervish is a special type of Islamic ascetic worshipper. So, what could have been a simple natural event is, by this description, transformed into a sort of microcosm of the Gnostic struggle between condemned yet potential-infused man and demonic nature. This is just the kind of conflict that we would expect in a Gnostic worldview. The physical world is not just there, it is the natural enemy of mankind, even though, as we'll see, a large part of mankind still belongs to it, the corrupt parts. The enemy is not just external, it is also internal. In his book, Mundik takes this point much further. His whole thesis is bringing out the Gnostic themes within McCarthy's work, both in Blood Meridian and well beyond. One of my favourite of Mundik's observations is how McCarthy corrupts the sun and the image of the sun. In an awful lot of literature and philosophy, the sun is a symbol of knowledge and of goodness. The form of the good is represented as the sun in Plato's analogy of the cave, and it is painted oftentimes in many, many books as the ultimate life giver, the thing that allows us to make food from mere soil. But McCarthy takes that symbol and twists it inside out. He calls the sun urine-coloured, and even the title of the book, Blood Meridian, or The Evening Redness in the West, paints sun-related language in blood. The implication is pretty clear. The world in this novel is not a beneficent life-giver, and neither is the sun. The whole natural world is instead a malevolent altar to blood and violence. We'll be coming back to this theme later when we discuss human violence directly, so, I don't know, tuck this idea away in your brain pockets. The important thing for now is to remember that human violence is not the only form of violence in McCarthy's novel. The world, by its nature, is seen as infused with violence. But of course, this does also stretch to the way McCarthy sees the human being. As Mundick points out, the kid is seemingly born with violence in his heart, and McCarthy is actually pretty keen to never set up some kind of simple moral opposition between violence of man on the one hand and good nature on the other. Man's inhumanity instead sort of follows naturally from the general world's inhumanity. This point is probably best recognized by extreme contrast. In something like Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, which is another book that I really like, a clear opposition is made between nature, which is implicitly good, and the corrupting influence of man exerting his rapacious will on nature, reflecting what Tolkien saw as the destruction and perversion of nature by ever-encroaching industrial forces. Thus, technology and man's corrupt designs are set against nature, which is itself seen as uncorrupt. This kind of thing is precisely what we don't see in Blood Meridian. While we've just looked at how McCarthy personifies nature in hostile and mythological terms, he also describes humans and the gang like this. For instance, here is a passage that's about the gang riding through the street. Those riders seemed journeyed from a legendary world, and they left behind a strange tincture like an afterimage on the eye, and the air they disturbed was altered and electric. Elsewhere, the gang is compared to an imp, used by the governor of Chihuahua to combat natives and bandits, but which is inherently uncontrollable and eventually turns on whoever summoned them. Mankind is not seen as separate to nature, but rolled into it, and both of them are given spiritual yet malevolent depth. However, all is not lost. Although McCarthy's descriptions make mankind continuous with and a part of hostile nature, he also most commonly describes mankind as pilgrims or acolytes. That is, as people in search of deep spiritual or religious truth. And this is where we see that divine spark from Gnostic theology manifest in the novel, and thus the main separation between man and nature in Blood Meridian, although it is a pretty thin line. A really good article on this is Leo Doherty's Gravers, False and True, Blood Meridian as Gnostic Tragedy, and he says the following. Early in Blood Meridian, the reader comes upon this passage. The survivors slept with their alien hearts beating in the sand like pilgrims exhausted upon the face of the planet Anarita, clutched to a namelessness wheeling in the night. Anarita was believed in the Renaissance to be the planet which destroys life, and violent deaths are caused when the malefics have agents in the anaretic place. Because McCarthy has not placed a comma after pilgrims, it is likely that his simile induces the entire remainder of the phrase. Yet, it is easily possible to read the passage as if a comma were present, thus producing the reading, "This is Anarita." Although this is not a description of Glanton's gang, it is still reflective of the general view of humanity in Blood Meridian. They are often as brutal as the world, but at the same time, there is something in them that is alienated from that brutal world, and to that extent, they are also victims of it. This sense of alienation is repeatedly emphasized by McCarthy. Doherty also famously interprets the Judge as an archon, a kind of Gnostic demon and architect of the world who tries everything in his power to prevent mankind from making contact with anything higher, or discovering and nurturing that divine spark. This picture of humankind, whereby it is mostly brutal, but is also not quite at home with its own brutality and capable of so much more, is essentially a Gnostic picture. It mirrors the idea that most of us originates from the demiurge or the archons, but there is a little pocket of us that belongs to the true God and is indeed part of that true God. And that pneuma, that divine spark, can lead to liberation. In Gnostic terms, our flesh and psyche may be corrupt, but our spirit is not. On this reading, McCarthy is not a nihilist about humankind, but he is markedly pessimistic. It's that dot of optimism on an ocean of pessimism that we referenced earlier. It is, after all, only a divine spark. It's not a full-blown fire. So we can see Blood Meridian in this Gnostic sense as a battle for the souls of the men in the gang, one that most of them, or potentially all of them, will lose. The last piece of properly Gnostic-tinged imagery that I want to talk about are the continual references to the idea that God has fled the physical world or has otherwise become uninvolved with it. Mundik also mentions this point, and most of the time it is communicated through demonstrating the inefficacy of traditional religious symbols or institutions. In one memorable passage, the entire population of a settlement, or near enough, flee into a church, hoping that God would protect them, only to be cut down by their assailants all the same. In another, the gang find a hollowed-out church, and within there are two madmen who have lived there for years and totally lost their marbles. These two images help to articulate the twin inefficacy of God in McCarthy's world. The first shows that God cannot protect the bodies of men, and the second shows that he cannot protect their minds, or if you prefer, their souls. Near the end of the book, when the kid is working as a caravan guard, that group of ascetics are slaughtered as they gather round a cross. And it's worth noting that there are kind actions in Blood Meridian that do reflect that divine human spark of goodness, but they just tend to be few, far between, and pretty small scale. There are the women who take the trouble of washing the mentally impaired man, and the Native Americans who rescue Tobin and the kid in the desert. It's not that there is no such thing as kindness in McCarthy's world, but these acts are just dwarfed by the scale of the brutality on show. All of this helps create the effect that goodness, piety, and justice, the classic virtues of the old world, are ineffectual in this land. They are condemned by the judge as mirages, and the world conspires to support his hypothesis. And this sets up one of the main thematic conflicts in the book. What does man's conduct look like, and what does man itself look like when it realizes that morality and God, whatever their lofty metaphysical status, have no direct causal power in this phenomenal world? In such a state, it is inevitable that something would come to fill the nihilistic, valueless void. But what is going to doom the men to their fate? Or rather, who will? 4. Values and violence. One of the oldest philosophical questions ever is, how should I live? Or just, what is a good life? Out of such questions, the whole Academy of Ethics was built. Everyone from Plato to Aristotle to the proudly unsystematic Montaigne to the ever-faithful Kierkegaard and the system-creating Kant have given answers to these questions. Yet, in Chapter 17 of Blood Meridian, the judge builds an entirely different picture of reality and morality, one that prizes violence above all else, and where raw force is all that matters. The dialogue begins when one of the gang declares, "The good book says that he that lives by the sword shall perish by the sword," to which the judge replies, "What right man would have it any other way?" So commences perhaps the most detailed presentation we have of the judge's own philosophy. I'm going to read a long section of it now, but I promise it is highly relevant. "It makes no difference what men think of war," said the judge. "War endures. As well ask men what they think of stone. War was always here. Before man was, war waited for him. The ultimate trade awaiting its ultimate practitioner. That is the way it was and will be. That way, and not some other way." He turned to Brown, from whom he'd heard some whispered slur or demur. "Ah, Davy," he said, "it's your own trade we honour here. Why not rather take a small bow? Let each acknowledge each." "My trade? Certainly." "What is my trade?" "War. War is your trade, is it not?" "And it ain't yours?" "Mine too, very much so." "What about all them notebooks and bones and stuff?" "All other trades are contained in that of war. Is that why war endures?" "No. It endures because young men love it and old men love it in them, those that fought and those that did not. This passage is often skimmed over as the judge simply being a nihilist, saying that nothing matters and so it's just dog eat dog. But if we look more closely, he's not talking about war neutrally, he's talking about it admiringly. He's saying that war is the real and true judge of humankind. And why is this? Because although it predates humankind, humankind seemingly can't help but respect and honour it. It is, as he puts it, the ultimate clash of wills. The fact that the judge does say war predates mankind should clue us in that he is using the term somewhat more broadly than we would. And indeed, later on in the same section, he says the following. War is the truest form of divination. It is the testing of one's will and the will of another within that larger will, which, because it binds them, is therefore forced to select. War is the ultimate game, because war is at last a forcing of the unity of existence. War is God. That is, war is the judge's word for, among other things, the general battle for domination that occurs at every level, among men, among beasts, and even among forces. He considers it a god because anything else, be it a morality or a wish or a desire or an idea, if it wants to exert anything on the world, will have to partake in this game of war broadly construed. Without such force, the abstract idea may as well just not be there. As he puts it, the argument is indeed trivial, but not so the separate wills thereby made manifest. Argument here is not conceived of as a means to arrive at the truth, or, as Socrates might have it, to arrive at goodness or justice. The idea, in the judge's eyes, is only material inasmuch as it is manifested by a will. I cannot say for certain what McCarthy was thinking here, but it does remind me of some views that were sometimes attributed to Friedrich Nietzsche at and before the time Blood Meridian was being written, back when most people thought he was just a philosopher of bloodthirst. We do see a number of Nietzschean motifs, like the judge's continual dancing, which is a recurring motif in Thus Spake Zarathustra. The reason why I don't want to draw a kind of one-to-one comparison between the judge's philosophy and Nietzsche's is because I think that it rests on a misunderstanding about Nietzsche that I've spoken about on the channel before. Nonetheless, there is some relevance that we'll come to later. After the judge has finished his speech in praise of war, he searches around for rival gods, rival values, seemingly wishing to demonstrate their rank inferiority to his. And so he turns to the ex-priest Tobin, now a member of Glanton's gang, who has himself shot men in the back only a few chapters before. And we get the following exchange. "But what says the priest?" he said. Tobin looked up. "The priest does not say." "The priest does not say," said the judge. "Nihil dicit. But the priest has said, for the priest has put by the robes of his craft and taken up the tools of that higher calling which all men honour. The priest also would be no god-server, but a god himself." Two things immediately leap out about this passage. The first is that the judge identifies the human wish for force and power as also the wish to become a god and to take pleasure and satisfaction in holding someone else in the palm of their hands. The second, of course, is that the judge considers Tobin already a convert to his god of war, because whatever he might happen to say, Tobin is a member of Glanton's gang. Tobin has killed, maimed, scalped, and tormented with the best and the worst of them. His silence is thus simply him being in denial. He is already a disciple of the judge, indeed, if not in word. Other members of the gang had given similar dissenting interjections during Holden's speech. Jackson and Irving had quoted scripture, proclaiming that might does not mean right. Davy seemed to take offence at the idea that his trade was war. The judge is even called crazy. But he's not perturbed by any of this, because what he said to Tobin could just as easily apply to any other member of the gang. They too are acolytes of war, however much they might wish to deny it. A lot of analyses of this scene stop roughly here, but let's just linger a little bit longer. Because while the judge has talked a lot about domination and power and clashes of wills, he's left the most potent kind of domination unsaid, and it's the one that he specialises in. The domination by a set of values. In his book, Nietzsche's System, John Richardson argues that Nietzsche thought one of the highest forms of power was the ability of one thing, be it a drive or a person, to impose its values on another thing. So, One example of this kind of value or aim-based domination at the subpersonal level would be if, as Schopenhauer argued, the sex drive was able to deceive the other drives behind our perceptual judgments, such that we came to see someone that we fancied as much more alluring than they actually were, emphasizing their positive qualities and downplaying their negative ones. As Richardson puts it, drive A rules B insofar as it has turned B towards A's own end, so that B now participates in A's distinctive activity. If we apply this idea at the personal level, as opposed to the subpersonal one, we can see that, although the members of the gang, like Glanton, Davy, and even the ex-priest Tobin, have in one sense tasted godhood by the judge's own warmongering standards and have become more powerful, more accomplished in the art of war, they are still ultimately subjugated by the judge. And this is not because the judge domineers over them physically. In fact, he does very little physical intimidation of his fellow gang members at all in the novel. Instead, they are dominated by his values. Without necessarily knowing it, they are living life, behaving life, and evaluating life by the judge's rules. This may be why the judge is the only character who seems content and happy even at the darkest moments of battle. Conflict itself is naturally a good for him, and he's managed to impose this idea on the other members of the gang. The judge is considered a physically powerful man, but his real power is rhetoric, language, and persuasiveness. The gang knows this because the judge is their resident smooth talker. When they're in Chihuahua, it is the judge who talks to the governor. The judge speaks multiple languages and, over the course of the novel, talks to people in Spanish, Dutch, and German to get the gang out of trouble, to get them work, and to persuade people to aid them. As is so often the case with McCarthy, this polyglottism serves a symbolic purpose as well. The judge can charm people because he can speak to what they already value and then turn those values, and thus the person's mind, to his own purposes. Again, the gang knows this. That's how they use him. But they don't realize that they are just as much the victims of the judge's uncanny ability as anyone else. In fact, they're even more so. Whereas the judge has persuaded others to confer on him and the gang some material benefits, the gang have become extensions of his value system and thus his will. He is their priest and they are his acolytes, whether they admit to it or not. Nonetheless, it would be a mistake to think that the judge is the only person in the novel who organically values violence. Sure, he values it most openly, but in this, he's partly just reflecting an undecorated version of the same violence worship that pervades even the so-called innocents in Blood Meridian. Take the people of Chihuahua, for example. Here is how they greet the gang when they return with all of the scalps of the men, women, and children that they have slain due to the governor's bounty. On the 21st of July in the year 1849, they rode into the city of Chihuahua to a hero's welcome, driving the harlequin horses before them through the dust of the streets in a pandemonium of teeth and whited eyes. Small boys ran among the hooves, and the victors in their gory rags smiled through the filth and the dust and the caked blood as they bore on poles the desiccated heads of the enemy through that fantasy of music and flowers. The people of Chihuahua are almost as celebratory of violence as the judge, provided, of course, it is violence done to their enemies. And remember, these are not just fighting men the gang have killed, it is innocent children as well. In some ways, the judge simply extends this reasoning one step further and makes his celebration of violence honest and undisguised, free of flower and pageantry. However, there is a distinction between violence as a means to an end and violence for its own sake. And we see this transformation in the gang themselves. Initially, they are killing people for money, and they are pretty ugly and indiscriminate about this. As I said, their first kill in the novel is an old woman whose only crime is being Native American. But they are still mercenaries. Contrast this with later in the novel, when they are fully given over to the judge's ideology. Well, then they start to kill seemingly for the hell of it. They drive a group of innocent mule herds off the side of a cliff just because they can. When they have the immensely profitable ferry scam, we get the following description of Glanton. he seemed to take little account of the wealth they were amassing. Although daily he'd open the brass lock with which the wood and leather trunk in his quarters was secured, and raise the lid and empty whole sacks of valuables into it. The trunk already holding thousands of dollars in gold and silver coins, as well as jewelry, watches, pistols, raw gold in little leather staves, silver in bars, knives, silverware, plate, teeth. To put this in perspective, $1,000 in 1849 would be worth about $42,000 today. So the fact that they seemingly have thousands of dollars, a huge fortune just lying around, and yet Glanton is almost totally uninterested, suggests that they have moved beyond just monetary incentives. The gang, including Glanton himself, are now fully on board with violence for its own sake, no matter what meagre objections they may raise to the judge. And yet, at the same time, this worship of violence is explicitly shown to be self-defeating. The judge never denied that those who live by the sword do indeed die by it. He just thought that was only right and proper. And when the gang are slaughtered by the Yuma, we see the culmination of what the judge has taught them. The judge himself could not care less, since as long as someone is waging war, his values are being enacted. Even the Yuma cannot escape the implicit domination of the judge, and they follow his will even when they are attacking him and attacking his gang. The relationship the gang has to the judge mirrors the relationship that many a morality tale protagonist has towards a dark, malevolent force beyond their control that they make dealings with. In Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, Faust makes a deal with Mephistopheles, and by extension the devil, trading his soul for powers and knowledge beyond reckoning. And yet, he finds that, in the end, none of that was worth an eternity in hell. What profit a man to gain the whole world, yet lose his soul? In a similar way, the judge worms his root into the gang's lives by saving them from being brutally killed by a group of Native Americans. And while he's there, he sort of takes Glanton under his wing. We're told that the two men become close, almost conspiratorial, and that they have a kind of dark pact. It's tempting to interpret all of this literally and say that the judge actually is the devil or a Gnostic archon or a demiurge, and those are the kind of interpretations that I looked at in my last video on the judge. But I prefer a more symbolic view. If the judge is an embodiment of the values he represents, then this short event mirrors the effects of those values on the men in Glanton's gang. First, it saves them, raises them up, and makes them demigods on Earth. And then they too are consumed by it. We see this in the dream the kid has of the counterfeiter. Just as he is making counterfeit currency, the judge is creating something akin to counterfeit values. That is, he is answering the question, what is a good life, with a shiny, compelling, but ultimately empty and self-destructive answer, one that will lead those who follow his message to their death. It is no coincidence that the very first thing we see the judge do is tell a lie that gets a man killed. In some ways, this is all he ever does. So then the question remains, who would fall under the judge's spell? And nowhere is this question more significant than in our quasi-protagonist, the kid. So let's take a look at him now. 5. The Kid and the Question of Man. The kid has a sort of unenviable position in Blood Meridian. He is the protagonist and ostensibly the main character, and yet he is pretty much always overshadowed by all the more obviously interesting characters around him. But the kid is also one of the only characters who goes through a genuinely sophisticated character arc. The first thing we're told about the kid is that he was born with a taste for mindless violence, and that he had a neglectful and drunken father, and also that he ran away when he was 14. We also get this line about him on the very first page. All history present in that visage. The child, the father of the man. This is a play on a line from Wordsworth, but it also means that the kid, as a child, sets the stage for the kid as an adult. And although it's only on the first page, I think this relationship between the kid's father and the kid himself is quite revealing. For one thing, it ties back into those ideas about God's powerlessness we saw earlier. Here, the father is powerless to shape the destiny of his progeny, the kid. Now, you could take this as setting up the kid as a sort of reflection of Christ. This is how Mundit takes things, and while I think it is a very interesting interpretation and very plausible, I also think that it makes the kid seem like seem like less of an everyman. I instead like to see this opening as mirroring the more general failed relationship between God, as the source of all that is good and just, and mankind, his own children, who in most of Blood Meridian eschew this goodness and choose violence and brutality instead. But on a less symbolic level, it also illustrates the kid's vulnerability and sets up that he may be a good target for the judge's ideology. He has a pre-existing tendency for violence and also has no other firm value system that's been handed to him by a parent that can rival the one given to him by the judge. Petra Mundik focuses on how the kid being born violent illustrates McCarthy's Gnostic idea that most of the human person is inherently corrupt. But the lack of definite upbringing also doesn't just mean that his violence is presented as innate, it means that his kindness is as well. The story of the kid is one of broad subservience to the violent ideology of the gang, but also with these quiet moments of resistance in between, normally in a pretty passive form. The kid is noticeably absent in the descriptions of the gang's most gruesome crimes, suggesting that if he did take part in them, it was not in a major way. While the kid is a part of the gang, and by the end he's technically one of its longest-standing members just because so many have died, he also seems just slightly set apart from them. Once the gang falls apart and the judge is pursuing the kid and Tobin through the desert, he confirms this separation, saying, "There's a flawed place in the fabric of your heart. Do you think I could not know? You alone were mutinous. You alone reserved in your soul some corner of clemency for the heathen." This underlying clemency, and it's worth noting not just clemency for Native Americans, is most obviously demonstrated in these small acts of kindness that he shows for other members of the gang. For instance, at one point, a fellow gang member, Brown, is walking about the camp trying to get anyone, to help him dislodge an arrow in his leg. In the context of the Old West, the arrow will almost certainly kill him if it's not removed, and yet no one steps up to help him. The kid eventually agrees to and thus saves this man's life, only to be reprimanded by Tobin because the man would not have done the same for him, and may even have killed him if he failed. These little specks of kindness in the kid's actions, even when it is at risk to himself, clue us in on the idea that he might not be totally on board with the gang and the judge's value system. The kid's status as something symbolic or standing in for wider humankind is then cemented by that moment on the mountain where he is confronted by a burning tree, mirroring Moses and his call to free his people from slavery in Egypt. This is a pretty broad and unspecified allusion, and thus it could be taken in many different directions. But personally, I choose to interpret it as making the kid a figure of potential. He is being singled out as the one who, in theory, could reject the judge's philosophy should he so choose, and thus free his own soul, and maybe even the souls of others, from their slavery and submission to him and his ideas. And I just think it's worth bearing in mind that the kid actually does get the chance to kill the judge, to gun down what is then a defenseless and unarmed man, and he purposefully chooses not to. This is in extreme contrast to the start of the novel, where the kid would often start fights and seriously hurt people over small perceived insults or minor disagreements. We are thus given a scrap of hope that the kid will permanently free himself from the judge's grasp, and this is illustrated by his refusal to use the judge's own violent creed on him. This is what makes it all the more tragic when the kid does kill that young man at the campfire, seemingly over an insult. I don't think it's a coincidence that, having not seen the judge for 18 whole years, it is after this act of near senseless violence that the judge walks back into the kid's life. The kid has once again fallen under the spell of the judge's value system, so the judge can once again find him. And not long after, the judge seems to kill him, so this could be seen as a classic tragic ending. The kid has tried to escape his tragic flaw, but once again has fallen prey to it, and thus we conclude that it is in his nature to follow the judge into death, war, and violence after all. And yet, the ending of the kid's story, I think, is far more ambiguous than this. When the other members of the gang are killed, it's not through the judge's direct intervention. Importantly, it's because something they have done in service of the judge's values comes back to bite them. Some of them are killed in shootouts, others are hanged, others meet their end in the Yuma raid. But the kid is enveloped and killed by the judge directly and left in a horrifying heap in some outhouse. And it seems to me that you can take this in a number of directions, interpretively speaking. When I first read this, I actually saw it as the kid, in a twisted sort of way, defeating the judge. Whereas the judge manages to capture the flesh, soul, and spirit of the other gang members, he can only ever get his hands on the kid's physical form. He may have broken his body, but the kid is not completely corrupted on the inside. However, I have seen others take a very different interpretation of the ending. They interpret it as the judge's embrace of the kid being symbolic rather than literal, and it not being the kid's body that the people discover, but the missing little girl's who has been murdered by the kid. Under this reading, the judge's victory is total, and any attempt the kid made to escape his fate was doomed from the start. I'm not sure how I feel about each of these interpretations, but following Mundik, I think it might help to reflect upon a scene earlier in the novel where the kid has his fate read with some tarot cards. His card is the Four of Cups, which traditionally represents indecision, apathy, or boredom. This would suggest that the kid never fully commits to the judge's philosophy, but he also doesn't fully reject it either. He seems to be a perfect mirror of the uncommitted potential that, to a certain extent, we all have under Gnostic theology, but that goes tragically unrevealed and unexplored in almost everyone. Maybe this is why the judge has to resort to actually physically killing the kid with his own hands rather than dominating his will, like he does with all of the others. The kid is neither some perfect light in the darkness for us to follow, nor is he completely taken over by the judge and the judge's values. He remains notably uncommitted right up until the end. And although his apathy may seem better than Glanton's relishing brutality, they do both end up dead, and their potential is just as wasted in either case. I don't know exactly what to take from the ending of Blood Meridian, and maybe this is part of the point. McCarthy is notoriously secretive and tight-lipped about what actually he had in mind when he wrote any of his books, and there is so much rich symbolism in here that it could be interpreted in a huge number of ways while remaining satisfying. For me, it brings out all of the ways in which the kid is similar but also different from the other gang members. He is different in that he is uncommitted to evil, but he is similar in that he is not committed to good. He's different in that he holds on to that Gnostic potential, that divine spark, and yet he is similar in that he does end up wasting that potential all the same. He is different in that the judge never fully captures his will, and yet he is similar in that, well, the judge simply dominates him in another way. If the kid is meant to stand in for humanity as a whole, then what does this tell us about the great mass of mankind, including ourselves? Are we like the kid, apathetic enough to not fully give in to evil, yet not good enough to resist it? Should we praise the kid for not totally giving in, or should we reprimand him for simply taking the longer, shallower route to perdition? Is it even possible for people to escape the judge, or is he truly everywhere, around every street corner and in each little act of malice that we do? Such questions can't be answered here, but surely they must be asked. Within the story of the kid is the story of mankind, and each of our human relationships to violence. Maybe we simply ought to ask ourselves how we judge and react to the kid's conduct. But I just want to touch upon that concept of inevitability, because there's a key part of Blood Meridian's theory of violence that I have yet to discuss, but I think that it might help resolve some of its seeming internal tensions. 6. The Circle of Violence. Around the campfire one night, the judge tells the tale of a man who ran a harness shop at the side of a road with his wife and son, but soon turned to begging to make ends meet. One day, a traveller passed by and spoke to the harness maker in a way that both recognised his humanity and made him ashamed of how far he had fallen. The harness maker invited the traveller back to his house, where the traveller offered him 2 coins to alleviate his poverty. The harness maker remained ungrateful and requested more money, and the traveller reprimanded him, saying that he was a loss to God and man alike, and would remain so until he took his brother into his heart as he would take himself in, and he come upon his own person in want, in some desert place in the world. Humbled by this speech, the harness maker swore that he would change his ways, and offered to walk the traveller some way down the road. But when they came to a forest, the harness maker murdered the man and stole his clothes. telling his family that the pair of them were ambushed. His wife mourned the man and frequently visited the woods to pay her respects. On his deathbed, he told his son what he had done, and the son forgave him. Then we get the following passage. But the boy was not sorry, for he was jealous of the dead man, and before he went away, he visited that place and cast away the rocks and dug up the bones and scattered them in the forest, and then he went away. He went away to the west, and he himself became a killer of men. We are told that the traveller too had a son, and that the son was deprived of his father, and the opportunity to see his father become imperfect and be imperfect. And so he will have this uncompromised idol forever before him for the rest of his life. And it's implied that this is very much for the worst. The fable is not mentioned again until right at the end of the novel, in the part set in 1878, long after the gang has broken apart. After the kid shoots that adolescent boy, his friends tell us something about that boy and his little brother, who is no more than 12 years old and who now has no one in the world to care for him. They come out here from Kentucky, mister. This tyke and his brother. His mama and daddy both dead. His granddaddy was killed by a lunatic and buried in the woods like a god. He's never knowed good fortune in his life, and now he ain't got a soul in this world. Randall, you take a good look at the man that has made you an orphan. The orphan in his large clothes, holding the old musket with the mended stock, stared at him woodenly. He was maybe 12 years old, and he looked not so much dull-witted as insane. This boy, and now his dead brother, were the grandchildren of the traveller killed in the forest, and now they too are scarred by that directly, with this series of events leading to a situation where this young boy is already brandishing a musket at 12 years old, his brother, parents, and grandparents all dead. What this means is that both lineages of this act of violence in the forest all those years ago are now set to inflict and suffer violence themselves. Both the killer of men and this young boy are set down a brutal path by factors entirely outside of their control. They in turn will commit their own acts of violence, and so the cycle will continue, with no abatement or end in sight. Mundik talks at length about the repeated references and allusions to fate and destiny in the novel, relating them to the Gnostic concept of Haimamene, or however you pronounce that. I've given it a good shot. This force was said to dictate the fate of the world, and also simple physical events like planetary motion. It is true that this concept is often referenced or at least obliquely alluded to, such as when the judge gives a lengthy explanation of the orbits of the planets and the movements of physical objects, and argues that a similar explanation can be given of men and their behavior. It may be true that the future of all of these men really was fated, but even so, it's worth asking what the driving force behind their fate might be, especially taking into account the judge's picture of war and conflict as a kind of metaphysical base layer, simply working its greater will through the lesser wills of men. And I think that we can link this idea of fate or predetermination with the cycle of violence that we see exemplified at every level in Blood Meridian. There are the classic cycles of violence where one act of violence begets another in revenge, and on and on and on. The gangs succumb to this cycle of violence in their fights with the Yuma, who see their own future as they burn the bodies of Glanton's gang, implying that they too will end up suffering the same fate. It's only a matter of time. There are the cycles of violence between the Mexican authorities and Glanton's gang, as the authorities realize that the nightmarish force that they have unleashed on their lands can now only be quelled with more and superior violence. But I think more significant than any of this, at least for me, is the intergenerational and cross-temporal cycles of violence. The cycles of violence that persist the ravages of time and ensure that the fire of war is kept alight for a new generation. We see this in the descendants of the Traveller and the Harness Maker, but we also see it in the kid, whose neglectful father precipitates his fall into violence. When the kid guns down that adolescent in 1878, he gifts another generation the scar of violence, which they will carry on to the next generation, and so on, possibly until the end of time. However, while there is something undeniably depressing about cycles like these, they also, in a strange sort of way, offer small gifts of hope. The thing about a cycle is that it comes around again, and McCarthy heavily suggests that it is ignorance that keeps this cycle going. Near the beginning of the novel, the kid encounters a hermit in the desert. who says the following: "A man's at odds to know his mind, 'cause his mind is aught he has to know it with. He can know his heart, but he don't want to. Rightly so. Best not to look in there. It ain't the heart of a creature that's bound in the way that God has set for it. You can find meanness in the least of creatures, but when God made man, the devil was at his elbow. A creature that can do anything. Make a machine and a machine to make the machine, an evil that can run itself 1,000 years, not need to tend it." On the one hand, parts of this reinforce the idea that man's evil is inevitable and unstoppable, since humanity is analogized to a machine. But on the other hand, man is also the creature that can do anything. Man is called unbound, both for better and for worse. And this suggests that there is another possibility. A cycle is only hopeless if it is truly unchangeable. But if we take the hermit's framing, then it is only the unknowing man who is doomed to repeat the cycle. Of course, the knowledge necessary to break it may be incredibly hard to come by. The kid was meant to be our humble torchbearer in Blood Meridian, and yet he too succumbed to the cycle of violence and very much perpetuated it. But the hope is still there. It's still a possibility. As I said, Blood Meridian is profoundly pessimistic, but I think it stops just short of being outright nihilistic. While the kid might have failed to achieve the knowledge and self-knowledge needed to break this cycle, someone else further down the line might well do. The tragic tale of the kid is not the only tale out there, nor is it the last tale. Now, this young boy will endure the same kind of trial, and maybe he will fail, but then again, maybe not. Maybe this time the divine spark will win out. The epilogue of Blood Meridian even reflects this cyclical structure to violence and time in the novel, as well as the potential for change and the little scraps of hope along the way. Firstly, McCarthy deliberately emphasizes the circular nature of each whole and says that each perfect whole owed its existence to the one before it. Both of these reflect a sense of inevitability and this cyclical structure. We even have the watchers in the wilderness looking on, seemingly helpless to do anything to stop this cycle. And yet, at the same time, we have one of the clearest pieces of Gnostic imagery in the novel, which was actually the impetus for Leo Doherty's interpretation of Blood Meridian as a Gnostic tragedy, and thus arguably the origin of this whole line of viewing the book. He uses an implement with two handles, and he chucks it into the hole, and he enkindles the stone in the hole with his steel, hole by hole striking the fire out of the rock which God has put there. Symbolically, this calls back to that idea of Gnostic divine spark that we've talked about so much in this video. It reaffirms its existence and thus reaffirms the hope that someone will complete the kid's task. I like this idea because it leaves Blood Meridian with a small glimmer of light among its ostensibly tragic and dark story. I don't think that it would have achieved the level of acclaim that it did if it were simply a story about things going horribly wrong with nothing more complex mixed in. Instead, this seems to maintain the tension, this writhing and striving between the tiny part of divinity yearning to break free and the world, including the greater part of men, attempting to dampen and suppress it. And by presenting this picture of the human within such a thematically dense and emotionally compelling novel, McCarthy just sort of makes it hit home in a way that would be difficult by simply reading a set of Gnostic claims. McCarthy's descriptions of brutality are so intense that they force us to confront the real, felt significance of man's inner cruelty. And this makes the contrast of those small acts of kindness stick out all the more, like the fires of distant travelers across a nighttime desert landscape, to borrow an image from Blood Meridian. And while Blood Meridian might not allow humanity to win out, that is not necessarily so for all of McCarthy's novels. McCarthy's 2006 novel The Road follows a father and son as they cross a post-apocalyptic version of the United States. Spoiler alert for The Road, by the way. It deals with many of the same themes as Blood Meridian. It too overflows with brutality and inhumanity and the cold cruelty of nature and men. But whereas the young, potential-infused character in Blood Meridian falters on his path, the character of the son does not do so in The Road. The boy refuses to give up hope for mankind. He worries about people, he cares for them, and he does so with an almost unfathomable innocence given his circumstances. He reminds me of someone like Alyosha from the Brothers Karamazov. He is unflinchingly kind. And unlike his nameless namesake, the boy is loved and loves in return. He is cared for by his father, who tells him about the sparks of goodness in the world. The boy spends a lot of the novel worrying about another child that he saw briefly on the road, but that he and his father had to leave behind. And with his dying breath, his father says this to him: "Goodness will find the little boy. It always has. It will again." The boy lies down by his father, his deceased father, for 3 days, before rising again at the sound of incoming footsteps. A man and a woman are approaching, and they take him under their wing, promising to look after him. The woman, when she saw him, put her arms around him and held him. "Oh," she said, "I am so glad to see you." She would talk to him sometimes about God. She said that the breath of God was his breath, yet though it passed from man to man through all of time. I like to read this passage in conjunction with Blood Meridian, because despite its setting being, if anything, far bleaker, it still contains an explicit message of hope. To quote one of Mundich's essays, "The road is the logical extreme of the worldview presented in his earlier works, a culmination of moral and natural evil, violence, suffering, darkness, and despair, but with just enough hope and goodness to imbue the pages with a hint of soteriological potential." And despite the circumstances being even bleaker than in Blood Meridian, the boy does manage to break a cycle of violence. When a thief steals from him and his father, the boy rushes to forgive him. Despite all the violence he has gone through, the boy refuses to let himself become wicked. It seems that, a century and a half after the events of Blood Meridian, McCarthy has enough faith in the divine spark to think that the violent cycles can be stopped. The boy truly could look the judge in the face and refuse his offer. The boy takes up the duty that the kid faltered in fulfilling. And read like this, that campfire of hope in the night burns just a little bit hotter. And that is why, despite the nightmarish tone of Blood Meridian, the brutal scenes, and the seeming victory of the judge at the end, I still choose to interpret that tiny glimmer of hope as a crucial part of its world. It is the part that the boy will pick up, carrying the fire, as he and his father put it, and how he will become a truly redemptive force amidst McCarthy's barren landscapes. The judge may never sleep and may never die, but neither does the spark. Even amongst a cannibal wasteland devoid of order or compassion or trust, it worms its way into the heart of a small boy, born after the night has already fallen, and turns him into a redemptor. The kid may have failed, and so will many of us, but the mere idea that someone like the boy could remain compassionate amongst the craggy nihilism of the apocalypse gives us something to hold on to. But, having said all of that, I imagine that if you pick up Blood Meridian, you may have a very different experience and a very different interpretation. And I want to argue why this is an excellent thing. 7. Why you should read Blood Meridian. There is a small fear that I sometimes have with my channel that people will watch these videos and maybe even enjoy them, but they might not be actually excited to go and read the book or books that I'm talking about for themselves. So I just wanted to end this video by making a direct plea for you to read Blood Meridian, and why no video can ever come close to the experience of devouring it for yourself. There is suffering in the world, and there is cruelty in the world. We are so used to these facts that they almost don't bear repeating, and yet their mundanity does in no way detract from their profundity. The problems of suffering occupy some of the oldest ancient texts still extant. In 2100 BC, the Epic of Gilgamesh was written, which, among other things, details the grief and pain of Gilgamesh after the untimely death of his companion Enkidu. Around 1300 BC, a Babylonian wrote a piece called The Poem of the Righteous Sufferer, all about the trials and tribulations of Shubshi-Meshre-Shakan against injustice. 700 years later, the Book of Job was written, detailing the sufferings of Job, a good and faithful man who nonetheless undergoes unimaginable torments, eventually crying out to God and questioning why he has inflicted upon him such a fate. The problem of evil is traditionally seen as a particular issue for the monotheistic religions that posit an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God. It is thought that such a God simply would not allow suffering to exist, at least not in the quantities that we see it. Thus begins 1,000 disparate theodicies meant to reconcile this seeming contradiction. This is even alluded to in Blood Meridian, where the judge says that if God had an issue with men killing one another, then surely he would have stopped it by now. The lack of intervention is taken for tacit approval, and so evidence that if God does exist, he may not be so benevolent as it may first appear. However, I think that such religious issues are actually downstream of a much more primal and pre-theoretic complaint, which is the mere existence of suffering in the world and the mere fact of human brutality towards one another. This problem stretches far beyond those who believe in the tri-omni God of the Abrahamic theologians. The question still remains: how do we react to the sheer amount of pain in the world? How do we make sense of it? And how do we respond to it? The Stoics reacted by saying that even if something seems senseless and awful, it is all part of divine providence, whose will we cannot directly fathom. Certain Christians take the world as a trial or as a veil of soul-making, where we are, in some sense, made ready for our ultimate reunion with God. Someone like Schopenhauer thought that suffering was a simple, brute fact about reality, or that it fell out of the metaphysics of the world and its will, with no real reconciliation or permanent peace. For him, there are scant consolations for poor humanity, like temporary experiences of beauty, or the act of compassion, or, in some cases, learning to withdraw our will from the world. Some interpretations of Nietzsche, like that of Bernard Regenster, frame his whole normative project as an attempt to make sense of suffering and make it livable without the use of the ascetic ideal, and exploring how a human might affirm life in the face of pain and seeming hopelessness. But what does any of this have to do with Blood Meridian? Well, all these Gnostic themes, these philosophies that we've brought in, this interpretive work, is a reaction to the brutality of the novel and a reflection of this far wider question of how to actually deal with evil, both natural evil and human evil. And sure, you can recognize that this is an existential problem in the abstract, but the vivid descriptions of McCarthy's prose, its bleak tone, and its almost mysterious ability to arouse visceral disgust and repulsion in the reader bring this seemingly abstract philosophical issue very much down to earth and makes it motivating again. Its felt significance becomes incredibly hard to deny. I'm reminded of a conversation between Ivan and Alyosha Karamazov in The Brothers Karamazov, where they are discussing the problem of evil, and Ivan attempts to make Alyosha see the significance of the problem that this raises for his faith by describing the way a young boy was brutally torn apart by dogs on the orders of a nobleman. It is so easy to become detached from these sorts of horrific events, to calmly survey suffering in abstract terms from our philosophical parapets, and sometimes we need to have someone shake us by the shoulders, point us to a near unimaginable evil, and demand that we react to it or respond to it in some way. Alyosha's famous reply is to stay silent and kiss his brother on the cheek, in a move that's often interpreted as an affirmation of compassion in the face of seemingly overwhelming suffering. When reading Blood Meridian, you see horrors and brutalities framed and described in such a way that they just force you out of any lingering emotional stupor or apathy. That's why, like many, many books, there just isn't a way to recreate the experience of reading it with a video about it or by doing research around it. I can tell you about the violence within it and how I choose to interpret it, but I don't think that that is nearly as valuable as confronting it for yourself. When you're reading the tales of the Glanton Gang and seeing their vile and violent deeds and feeling each emotional beat, that's when you'll discover how you respond to it and decide what that means. So even if you think I am reading far, far too much into this book, and I very well might be, I really would encourage you to read it as well. It will help to tackle one of life's greatest and oldest questions: what to do with cruelty? Both the cruelty of the world to man and the cruelty of mankind to itself. Because, in a lot of ways, we are Gilgamesh and Shubshi-Meshre Shakan and Job and the Kid, we too are thrown into an imperfect world, and although I ideally hope that we will never have to confront the same level of horror in quite the same way that these bold Theodician warriors have, we will no doubt encounter some cruelties, sufferings, pains, and deaths in our own lives that we find it near impossible to make sense of. And these works may help us consider what we are going to do about them. And that is a question that no one can answer for us. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.